Recording in progress.
Right, so we're starting this webinar today. We're going to have a small chat before we get properly started. To let attendees get on. It normally takes a minute or so, but today that we have me, Jo Brew, and Marian Rutigliano, and we're going to discuss Mary Daly's Gynecology, so the book Gynecology, and we think it's going to be, it's very difficult to do it justice because it's such an amazing book, but we're going to do the best we can. And it's the sort of book that really is just best to read, but we're going to pick out some of the things and the parts of the book that really helped us, or we think why we think it's so good. And as everybody, I guess you all know, welcome. We've got loads of participants already. We've got sort of nearly 40 of us here. You put comments in the chat, and if you have questions, put some questions in. We'll try to answer them. This webinar is going to go on for 1 hour, and it's in a series that continues. We're going to put it on YouTube afterwards, and hopefully you'll get quite a lot out of it. So, welcome, Marian. So,
hi.
We're talking about gynecology. Can you tell us, introduce gynecology and why you like it, etc.?
Gynecology. You should know that I have no claim to fame. I've never written a book myself. I'm just old. I came out into the women's movement in 1969. And you know, the first feminist book I ever read was Sexual Politics. I was 15 years old. It was a tough read. And I grew up in it. You know, I was in New York City, and I followed, you know, and I watched from behind as the radical lesbians all went down the aisle in the auditorium at Now. So I read all these books, and I read them when they first came out, and I grew up in what was then women's liberation and radical feminism, and saw radical feminism being born. Mary Daly, this book came later. It was not her first book. Her first book was The Church and the Second Sex. Second book was Beyond God the Father, and her third book, 1978, was Gynecology. With the you know, and we heard that it talked about, you know, patriarchy, which we'd all heard of, and that it approached patriarchy as a religion of men oppressing women, which fit in with the class analysis that we were seeing that radical feminism was. Mary Daly, she taught at Boston College, which was a Catholic college. It is still a Catholic college. It had been previously all men. By the time she got there, it was co-ed, and that caused her some difficulties because she wouldn't let male students into her advanced women's studies classes. Men could take the introductory class, and then she would privately teach or tutor a man who wanted to take any of the advanced courses, which kind of went for a while. But after a while, you know, they kept pressuring her. Boston College kept pressuring her. They wouldn't give her a professorship. And finally, 2 male students, you know, lodged a formal complaint, and she wound up being pressured to retire in, I think, 1999. So that, you know, and then she wrote 2 more books after that, you know, Pure Lust and the Wickedary. Reading Gynecology, I read it when it first came out. I read it again, and I looked over it, you know, during the past week or so, and you know, there's so much in there. People are really daunted by it. They kind of look and say, what do I do? I can tell you a few things that, seriously, you should read it. A few things is, I only had the privilege of seeing her speak live only once, which was really amazing. And she had an incredible way of talking, and there's YouTube videos around, which you should look at, because when you see her speaking live, you realize that her writing is how she talks or lectures. That, you know, and when I saw her speaking, I was like, oh, this is why the book is written the way it is. It's like, it's just talking. So, you know what, try just reading it out loud.
Yeah. And so Marian, can you tell us about when you saw Mary Daly speaking live? Where was it, and what was she talking about?
In Boston. Excuse me. in Boston, and she just, she basically just talked, lectured passages from gynecology that I had read, kind of gotten, and but when I was listening to her, and it was like, and I don't like audible books. I mean, I just don't. But this one book, when you hear her talk, you know, that's how the book is written. It's her just talking. It's not stream of consciousness, because everything's there, but there's just so much, that if you hear her saying it, or if you hear it out loud, for some reason I just found out that made it clearer. So you might want to try that. The other thing is don't worry about the words that she's invented or adapted. I mean, she says that she's gonna, invent words, adapt words, or find the underlying meaning of words. And that's the general idea, is that words mean something. I mean, she talks about the word hag, and that comes from what is it? Hagiography, being the biography of saints and saints' lives. Well, that's pretty far from what we call hags today. Then it got into hagiology, which is a description of sacred writings. Hagios is the Greek word for holy. And then finally, hag, from the Old English word meaning harpy or witch. So she talks about how words devolved and what they mean. So, but don't worry.
I mean, a good thing, I think, is the way that she talks about, say, the word like hagiography, which I can't say, but then she reclaims it. She sort of says that that study of saints within patriarchal religions are they're the women who we at radical feminists don't want to be like, because they're the male identified women who are sort of celebrated within patriarchy. And then what's great is that reclaiming of the word and sort of splitting up the word or getting back into it, and sometimes saying, well, we could take back the word hag to its original meaning, but also a new meaning, which is fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that it's a classic example of patriarchal reversals, which is something that comes up throughout the whole book, is that hagiography, the root of the word hag, well, if we're going to be the root of the word hag, we're the saints, but it has been completely reversed to make us be, evil witches or harpies. But don't worry about all those. We're just, when I was a kid, I had run of the house in terms of reading books, and I read, when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I read these books way beyond me, including Shakespeare. And my parents just said, if you don't know a word, just whatever you think it means, put it in there. And it works. I mean, you find that after a while you get a gestalt and understanding of it. So don't worry about if you don't get every word. And then finally, it sometimes it's helpful to just read it with other women. Just read it with other women.
Yeah, well, I'm going to now read out to everybody on page 9 of my copy. I've got this copy. I've also got this copy as well, which is older. This is newer. This came out later, and it's an English edition. And I think this one was published in the States. Anyway, I'm going to read out the title, Mary Daly's explanation of why she called it gynecology, which is really interesting and pertinent for today because of the ecological crisis that we're facing, apart from the other things. So what Mary Daly says, she says, the title of this book, Gynecology, says exactly what I mean it to say. Ecology is about the complex web of interrelationships between organisms and their environment. In her book, Le Feminisme ou la Mort, Françoise d'Aubonne coins the expression ecofeminism. So ecofeminism. So Mary Daly says that Françoise d'Aubonne coined the phrase, and she's citing her, unlike some writers who do not cite the women who came before them. Mary Daly does this all over this book, so it really is interesting to read through, because you just hear about so many different women who've either been in conversation or with Mary Daly, or they were in her study groups, or she met at conferences, or she's read the work. Anyway, so she cites Françoise d'Aubonne coming up with the expression ecofeminism. She maintains that the fate of the human species and the planet is at stake, and that no male-led revolution will counteract the horrors of overpopulation and destruction of natural resources. I share this basic premise, but my approach and emphasis are different. Although I am concerned with all forms of pollution in phallotechnic society, this book is primarily concerned with the mind, spirit, body pollution inflicted through patriarchal myth and language on all levels. These levels range from styles of grammar to styles of glamour, from religious myth to dirty jokes, from theological hymns honoring the real presence of Christ to commercial cooing of Coca-Cola as the real thing, from dogmatic doctrines about the divine host to doctored ingredient labeling of hostess cupcakes, from subliminal ads to sublime art. Phallic myth and language generate, legitimate, and mask the material pollution that threatens to terminate all sentient life on this planet. The title Gynecology is a way of wrenching back some word power. So Mary Daly, I think it really brilliantly is citing, she's showing that she is aware of the ecological existential threat that we have, but she's choosing to focus in her book, Gynecology, and in her other work on myth and the stories and the sort of language, patriarchal myth and language, and she's on this mind, spirit, body pollution, and that's her area. So that's what we get from her. And she doesn't talk a lot about ecology, but her aim is to help us struggle against it. So yeah, that I love that introduction.
I mean, she talks about ecology in this. I mean, she said she wasn't sure whether it was going to be gynecology slash or hyphen, but she made it a slash because you couldn't separate the two. You know, and she talks about men seeking death. Men seek the death of women. They seek the death of nature and the natural world, and they have a propensity for necrophilia. That's what they want, and you'll see the word necrophilia pop up, and we're seeing that now in the writings of some current feminists when they're talking about transhumanism. So she was a little prescient in that, but didn't know. Men seek the death of women, women give life, men cause death. And that's gynecology is sort of this female energy that if when you find it, when you come to consciousness from this patriarchal state of death, you find this female energy, and she just says it's like a sleeping death, and talks about, I think there's an introduction in one of the books that talks about someone who had worked with abused women who would say, and Mary Daly, talks about it too, women saying, I felt like there wasn't anything left of me. I felt like I was just dead inside. And that's what she means by necrophilia, is men seeking to put women in that state of just living death, and seeking to put the earth in a state of living death. She said that, women were imprisoned mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually by patriarchy, that we were possessed by it, and that we needed to move past it. And she talks about, and I'm going to go into some of the concepts and the way she terms them, the background and the foreground. Just, you need to know when she says foreground, that's us being deceived. That's men showing us just the superficiality of the outside world as they want us to believe it. The background is knowing what is really there and finding ourselves, and coming to life again.
I would sort of, yeah, it totally, I mean, it's totally like that. And a brilliant thing about this book, if you haven't read it, it's really, really worth reading, is that it describes the problem. So Mary Daly describes in the first two chapters, of the first two sections, she describes the myth and the patterning of patriarchal systems. And then she talks about the reality of a few of those atrocities, the patriarchal atrocities. But on almost every page, she gives us a route out. And she says, raging wild women, or women-centered women,
Right.
or women-centered lesbians can get out of this by breaking the mind bindings that patriarchy puts upon us. And I found when I read this for the first time that it completely transformed my life. I through reading the book, broke off loads of the mind bindings, and it substantially altered my life. And I think that reading this, so not only does it help you understand patriarchy and help you find ways to fight the system, it also can help you become or be as we would want to be if we weren't living in a patriarchal society. So we can sort of get outside patriarchy. So she gives these tools all the way through it that are practical tools that you can use, and then it actually improves your life right now. So just read sort of an hour of it, and you might get something that actually makes your life better, so you don't feel dead, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, she, all of the things she talks about. That's why I tell people, it's like, don't get hung up in the, in the words, in the exact words she uses. I mean, she talks about sado-ritual syndrome. I mean, you'll see that in there someplace. And after you read through it, you realize that all this is patriarchy, men stopping women from finding ourselves and from finding each other. I mean, that's ultimately what the purpose of it is. Dividing women against each other, and that women can find their way out of this maze. She calls it a maze, and we can find our way out. And part of it is by finding each other. You're right. She makes a comparison of like the different ways this has been manifested historically. She talks about the practice of sati, the widows getting flung on for flinging themselves on the funeral pyres of their deceased husbands. She talks about Chinese foot binding. She talks about female genital mutilation. She talks about the European witch burnings, American gynecology. That hit a little close to home since I had been trained to do that. Psychiatry, but underlying it all this, talking about a sado-ritual syndrome, that's just a tool for understanding what is being done to us, what men are doing to women. And she's very clear about labeling things correctly and naming the problem. There's one of my favorite passages in the book that's kind of really at the core of it is that, we get labeled as hags and harpies because we supposedly hate men. And she says, for some reason, women continue to be intimidated by the label anti-male. Some feel a false need to draw distinctions. For example, I'm anti-patriarchal, but not anti-male, right? The courage to be logical, the courage to name would require that we admit to ourselves that males and males only are the originators, planners, controllers, and legitimators of patriarchy. Patriarchy is the homeland of males. It is fatherland, and men are its agents. The primary resistance to consciousness of this reality is precisely described in Sisterhood is Powerful, and I love that she quoted Sisterhood is Powerful, thinking that our man is the exception, and therefore we are the exception among women. It's in the interest of men, as men in patriarchy perceive their interest, and in a superficial but self-destructive way of many women to hide this fact, especially from themselves. So despite all evidence that women are attacked as projections of the enemy, that men see us as the enemy, accusers ask us sardonically, do you really think that men are the enemy? This deception reversal is so deep that women, even feminists, are intimidated into self-deception, becoming the only self-described oppressed who are unable to name their oppressors. We refer instead vaguely to forces and roles and stereotypes, influences, and the point is that no agent is named, only abstractions. And that's, one of the most troubling things in talking with women, saying, oh, patriarchal is awful, but God, I love men. And the reversal is so profound that women say, men aren't the enemy. Well, that's nice you feel that way, but men think that we are the enemy. And when she talks about sado-ritual syndrome, all those things that she mentioned, sati, Chinese foot binding, those have all continued. I mean, the fundamental idea of hatred for women and wanting to just, silence women, kill women as the enemy, none of that has ever gone away. She talks about the characteristics of it, that, it's very, very detail oriented, in the foot binding manuals. There were very detailed instructions about how to get it down to, the 3 inches. It erases responsibility for all these atrocities so that no one is named. It's not men, it's not anybody. It's tradition. It's tradition.
I think that in her the second passage of the book, she looks at these different atrocities, and I'll just read out the different ones that she identifies. And while Mary Daly is looking at these atrocities, she tries to find patterns in them so that we can see what's actually happening. So she starts off with Indian sati, and then she does African or genital mutilation, she calls it, although we know FGM is everywhere now. European witch burnings, the next one, and she describes that really, really well, and finds that there are similar patterns. And then she does sorry?
Foot binding.
Foot binding, yeah, sorry. Then there's foot binding, which I missed out, I think. And then there's American gynecology, and which is global gynecology or sort of Western medicine. But when we bring it up to date, as she actually does sort of mention quite often in this book, but you can see the transgenderism and the abuse of women's bodies. If you see it in this, if you read the section on American gynecology, the obsession with problematizing women's bodies and then cutting them up and making women feel that their bodies are the cause of the problem. It's almost, you could almost, this is chapter 7, you can imagine she could have written chapter 8 and then just carry on with the same patterning.
Yeah, the American gynecology, it started with the birth of American gynecology with the names of the early gynecologists, Marian Sims, for example, who kept Black women as slaves to perform surgeries on, so he could learn about gynecology. And he's a big name. I mean, there's like the lateral Sims position that you put patients in. There are instruments named, surgical instruments named after these guys. And then she goes on to to later on practices of clitoridectomy to cure female masturbation, using castration, which is removal of the ovaries, to cure women's mental health ailments. And it's not, sorry, I have a cough. It's not limited to surgery. She talks about DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was given to women to prevent miscarriage in the 40s or 50s, mostly into the 60s, but had the horrible side effect of causing this otherwise rare clear cell adenocarcinoma of the cervix, which was very, very hard to treat, up till oral contraceptives, current oral contraceptives. And there was an oral contraceptive that was developed for men, and it was very effective, but it had side effects. Not even the kind of side effects that you see from women's oral contraceptives, but just like mild headache and maybe 1 or 2 other mild things. And they completely scrapped it because they said, well, men will never do it. But women can accept this risk. Women are given the risk of blood clots. Women are given the risk of any kind of mood stuff that comes with oral contraceptives. This is just wanting to destroy women. This is treating women as the enemy. This is very, very, very painful to see. And maybe it's good that there's a lot of other stuff that you kind of really get into, the words and the mythology, because it's very, very painful to see what is through the entire book, which is that men do through sati, foot binding. How about high heels, Sex in the City? It's very, very painful to see that men are doing this because women are the enemy, Yeah.
And I'm just going to jump back to the beginning bit of it where some of the, just to let you, to explain what she's doing as well, is it says, this is her introduction, Mary Daly's introduction, and it sort of explains, sets the scene for what she's trying to do. This book is about the journey of women becoming, that is radical feminism. So a key point that Mary Daly's making is she sees our liberation or our freedom is a journey, and we're becoming and being. So we're not static objects. She talks about the objectification of women, that men would like us to be sort of empty vessels and thingified or reified, as she talks about it. She's saying we're actually, it's the process, it's the being, it's the becoming, and it's a journey. And then she says the voyage is described and roughly charted here. So she says that her book is a rough charting of it. I say roughly by way of understatement and pun. We do not know exactly what is on the other side until we arrive there, and the journey is rough. The charting done here is based on some knowledge from the past, upon present experience, and upon hopes for the future. These three sources are inseparable, intertwined. Radical feminist consciousness spirals in all directions, discovering. So she splits this word, like, which is so brilliant, because it's like,
yeah,
immediately we remember all the covering up of all of our stories and our knowledge. So discovering the past and creating and disclosing the present future. So again, she's split the words, disclosing. So it's showing the agents of the closure of our lives and our present and our future and our past and our creativity. Well, when you understand the way she's using words, is she's saying we're going to stop it being covered up by discovering it or disclosing the present and the future. And that's sort of showing, she's laying out how she uses words to help us become free, and also for us to see what's been done with words. And that again is so important now, because the big word woman that is being changed and altered, and that we are being eradicated. So it's very, very useful, her methodology for our current struggle.
She does that with the word remembering, to remember. You take something that has been forgotten and make it a member of your memory again, make it a member of your life again. Because so much of what patriarchy tries to do, so much of what the destructive process is just making things disappear, diverting attention away from the horrors, and just saying it never happened, propaganda to discredit women who say that it never happened. So remembering is you uncover something and make it a member of your memory again, of the common memory again. That journey, she talks about it in passages, 3 different passages. First you kind of wake up and you see that something is wrong, that there's something that's hurting me, or you just don't know what's going on, but you start to wake up. The second passage, you find out, you try and see what these myths are that we're being told about what our lives should be. And then the third passage is finding things, finding oneself, being, making your environment internally and externally female centered. And she talks about female friendship is, finding out what it means to be together as women, and emerging out of the loneliness and isolation into friendship with other women, and finally refusing self-sacrifice, because that's what part of the death is like you sacrifice yourself for others.
Yeah, and on that thing,
and become dead. That's why women say, I feel so dead inside.
Yeah, and in the terms of the self, I think a lot of women here will have read it, so you'll remember, or do go and read it if you haven't read it. It's just amazing. So Mary Daly quite often talks. Well, she often has a capital self for the self, which is our radical feminist being, or our woman being, who we really are, if we're being authentic to ourselves and are outside these patriarchal mind bindings. And then there's the little s, and so she makes this distinction that the self,
Yes.
that is like plastic, or doing the master's work. So there's sort of token, she calls those token torturers, women who do the work of the patriarchy. She doesn't use the word handmaiden, I don't think, but it's sort of similar, the token women. And that I found that really useful, the idea that some aspects of who I think I am, or more in the past thought I was, could be, I could notice that they weren't really actually authentically who I believe I am and want to be. And they were doing things that I thought I had to because of the masters, the patriarchy, the professions, the schools. And once you start to see that some of the habits that you have are not necessarily really very helpful for yourself, that for your real self, that really helps. It's that was a very good point in her writing. The other thing I'll just quickly say is, I can speak reasonably good French and German and a bit of Italian. And I find if I go to, let's say, France, that's the language I can speak best. If I go to France and talk to people in French, there's a joy in knowing a language and having common words and understanding the grammar. And when you say words that mean things in another language, you communicate. And I find that using the language, the ideas, because it's so incredibly rich, that Mary Daly came up with, if I use some of that terminology, like a word like meta-patriarchal or remembering, with other women who've also read Mary Daly, it's like a language. It's like we all know French, or we all know that those ideas, and it sparks loads of, whether that's a word she uses, sparking ideas. And that's incredibly great when we meet together and we've read it, we know these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's why using women as scapegoats and the token torturers is such a hideously effective strategy. I mean, because it divides women. You know, she knows. I mean, she says later on that female bonding is a threat, and that it doesn't need to be a lot of women for it to be a threat, and that men get this far more readily than women do, because women who bond confirm reality to each other. And that's the language we're talking. And that's why, you know, women can read this coming from all kinds of backgrounds, and say, yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I mean, that's exactly how I felt. And that's why I tell women, it's like, you know, whatever part of the language and the way she's using language you can understand, that's great. Don't worry about the rest of it, because you'll learn part of the language. And that's why the token torturers, Aunt Lydia, I mean, that's why it's so awful.
Yeah. But
the other thing is that she one of the things that she stresses throughout that I think is so important, that and we talk about socialization, is that behavior that is normally unacceptable becomes acceptable, even normalized, as everyone becomes conditioned to it, as a ritual, or the way things are done, even though these are atrocities, and that this is a central strategy of male supremacy. So being able to have, you know, to have our separate language, like in China, there's records of a special women's language that women had to talk to each other, that men didn't understand. And to be able to break out of that, to be able to break through those central strategies of male supremacy, is by the way we can talk to each other and understand each other, is a hugely subversive thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, another thing I really like, we're jumping around here because there's so much in Mary Daly, and you're in gynecology, but also in her other books. And personally, I like Gynecology best and Pure Lust, the one that she wrote just after Gynecology, because she goes into more depth and seems to me, well, gynecology is probably the best, but then in Pure Lust, she gives loads and loads of ways to get to be very, you know, to feel great now, in terms of being meta-patriarchal, being outside patriarchy. So I think that that's really good. The thing I've really loved about knowing about her ideas, it really helped me to understand, is the idea of us being on this being a process and us being on a journey, and it's not a question of us writing one great article or producing one great video and then it's going to be okay, that thing will make it okay. What she really, or I really picked up from her, is that us being, the actual being of our lives, the living of our lives, the journey, the doing things, the process, and the going, you know, the movement, is our freedom. And it's so, I you know, we do lots of webinars, and I tend to think that it's in the doing that we're you know, in this thing, that we're in the movement, we're moving forward, and we're moving out of patriarchy, or having these non-patriarchal spaces. That dynamism is fantastic for me. I love that idea that we're not trying to get one thing done, we're doing it, and that's it. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's spinning. Spinning is movement. It's like, what is spinning? Well, it's moving. It's moving from that first passage to the second passage. It's movement. It's movement along the journey. It's just, you know, women who are alive inside are spinsters. They're spinning and weaving, and by that movement, by that journey, they move beyond male thinking. So all of these, you know, these terms, you know, spinning that she keeps using, spinning and weaving, it's movement. Just better reading one of the comments. The other thing that, you know, that I really like is that she is very, very forthright about the, you know, about the methods, you know, that are used to, you know, pull the wool over women's eyes or mystify us. You know, the erasure of women, the reversals, you know, dividing and conquering. The reversals are like, reversals are, it's, you know, we talk about Darvo now, but what she meant is, for example, a woman is abused by her husband, so she calls the police, and then she winds up getting arrested. A woman calls the police or calls somebody because her husband is abusing their kids, and then she winds up getting arrested for child abuse. That's, I mean, those are the, you know, kinds of patriarchal reversals she was talking about, and none of that has stopped, and we know now that it can be taken, you know, further or into other realms in terms of, you know, Darvo. It didn't happen. How dare you do that to me? And reversing victim and offender. That is like really fundamental strategy of patriarchy, which is how we know that the whole, you know, transgender thing is just this incredibly well-wielded and incredibly opportunistically well-developed tool of patriarchy.
Yeah, and there's a really good bit in, I don't know exactly where it is, but in Gynecology, where she says there are reversals, but then when we're trying to unpick and work out what the world is, sometimes simply reversing what the patriarchy does isn't the answer. So she talks about the you know, the concept of God, that simply saying, well, we feminists, we reject God the Father, so we're going to come up with the concept of goddess, the mother, is not the answer.
No,
and she explains very, very well that to a large extent, if you just simply reverse what the patriarchs have done to us, it doesn't actually get you anywhere. But instead of that doing a process of our being and finding out together as radical feminists where our journey takes us and what our reality is something, could be something quite different, something completely outside any of those things. I'll just read this bit because it's so nice, and it's what links up to what you were saying, Marian, about spinning. So Mary Daly says this: spinning deeper into the background. So the background is the area of where we're living outside patriarchy. It's one of those outside patriarchal spaces. So spinning deeper into the background is courageous sinning against the sins of the fathers. as our senses become more alive and we can see, hear, feel how we have been tricked by their texts, their writing, we begin unweaving our winding sheets. The process of exorcism, of peeling off the layers of mind bindings and cosmetics, is movement past the patriarchally imposed sense of reality and identity. This demystification process is amazing. So she splits it. The lies is ecstasy. And when I read things like that, it helps me to access that ecstasy. I just think, yeah, it's fantastic. It makes me really, really happy. So I get so much pleasure because from this, because she's helping us to access the ecstasy that we should have, and we do have. We can, you can have loads of fun in this life, which is, and we need it as well, and we deserve it.
Yeah, it's active. I mean, it's not just substituting, you know, the goddess for the god. I mean, one of the quotes is, you know, new age style goddess spirituality pacifizes women and blunts the radical impulse. And that, you know, so it's not radical feminism, and she used that term, is not becoming reconciled. It's finding yourself among women in the background. And I used to hear the phrase a lot more back in the day about abandoning men. You know, abandoning men. They want sexual services, what we now call emotional labor. She has a lot of other, you know, words for it in terms of what men want from women, which is basically our lives. But there used to be a lot of talk about abandoning men. So it's not just, you know, getting a good deal in prison. It's breaking out of the prison. And then at part of that, you know, that first passage of waking up is realizing that you're not just trying to reconcile yourself to a system. And it's not even necessarily destroying the system. It's walking away from it. I talk about, and I've used this before about you know, a POW camp, and understanding you know, radical feminism as a class analysis in that way, and that every decision individual women make is in the context of this structure. If you're a prisoner in a POW camp, you know, you can try to make the best deal for yourself to make your life easier. You can try to be nice to the guards. You can try having a relationship with a less savage guard. You can try having sex with the guards, and you can make decisions, but all these decisions are in the context of being imprisoned. The prison is the systematic way that men structure this. Society is structured, and men do this, and women need to break out of the prison. The only, you know, and women's like, but I have agency. I have one of the good ones. But you're a prisoner. You're making your decisions with whatever agency a prisoner can make. The only real agency is to just walk out of the prison, to abandon the guards, take all the other women with you. And that's, you know, that's like one of the really exquisite things that she talks about is just women. And that's that third passage, that final passage, is like finding other women and realizing the strength in even just a few women bonding. She even uses the word female bonding.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Well, I'm going to read a bit now about this. This is very good. It's very, very helpful what she's done. Her subtitle of the book, of gynecology, is The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism. I'm going to read out what she means by meta-ethics of radical feminism, because it's fantastic. So it's on page 11 of the American edition of the book. The subtitle of this book: by the subtitle, The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, I intend to convey that this book is concerned with the background, most specifically of language and myth, which is disguised by the father's foreground fixations. Merriam-Webster, that's a dictionary, the famous American dictionary. Merriam-Webster gives as one of the definitions of the prefix meta of a higher logical type in nouns formed from names of disciplines designating new but related disciplines, such as can deal critically with nature, structure, or behavior of the original ones. For instance, meta-language, meta-theory, meta-system. Despite the dullness of the dictionary diction, there are clues here. I would say that radical feminist meta-ethics is of a deeper, intuitive type than ethics. The latter, generally, that's the men's one, now generally written from one of several, but basically the same patriarchal perspectives, works out of the hidden agendas concealed in the texture of language, buried in mythic reversals which contain logic, most powerfully because they control logic. Sorry. So the mythic reversals control logic most powerfully because unacknowledged. Thus, for theologians and philosophers, Eastern and Western, and particularly for ethicists, women-identified women do not exist. The meta-ethics of radical feminism seeks to uncover the background of such logic, as women ourselves move into the background of this background. In this sense, it can be called of a higher, or read deeper, logical type. It is, of course, a new discipline that deals critically with nature, structure, and behavior of ethics and ethicists. It's able to do this because our primary concern is not male ethics or ethicists, but our own journeying. And linked up to that, she says that the primary source of her ideas is women's writing, like Carolyn Gage and Virginia Woolf and all the women in the movement, in the second wave movement that she was engaged with, and many other women. That's the primary source, and it's our lives, our being. And that she sometimes uses as secondary sources some of the male ethicists like Aristotle or Chomsky or these people, but she uses them mainly, often to just unpick the nonsense that they come up with, but sort of rarely. So that's fantastic. It's quite complicated, but it's definitely interesting as we're trying to understand feminist sort of ethics and our ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things she said is that the language and style of patriarchal writing can't carry the energy of women's exorcism or misogyny and ecstasy. Which is why she invents and discovers those word meanings and finds those hidden reversals. Even the common language, feminine and masculine, she says it's just roles and stereotypes, and it distorts and destroys the self. But it's not passive. She really rails against passivity, like when she talked about God of spirituality creating passivity. There's one. There's a reason she talks about enemy. Enemy implies war. She says that the rulers of patriarchy, males with power, wage an unceasing war against life itself. Since female energy is essentially biophilic, the female spirit body is the primary target in this perpetual war of aggression against life. Gynecology is the reclaiming of life-loving female energy. This claiming of gynergy requires knowing and naming the fact that the state of patriarchy is the state of war, in which periods of recuperation from and preparation for battle are euphemistically called peace. Furies, Amazons, must know the nature and conditions of this state in order to discover and create radical female friendship. Given the fact that we are struggling to emerge from an estranged state from each other as women, we must understand that the female self is the enemy under fire from the guns of patriarchy. We must struggle to discover this self as friend and to all that is truly female, igniting the fire of female friendship. So, when someone says, "So you see men as the enemy," I didn't start it. We didn't start it. They saw us as the enemy. The world is created with women as the enemy of what men want, and what they want, it's sexual services, emotional labor, and all that. But they're only the enemy because they declared war on me. I'd like to really just go away. I don't. It's like I don't want to kill men. I just want to send them away to another planet. I just don't want to be at war.
Yeah.
And we all are.
There's yesterday and this week I was rereading Gynecology, and I looked on online to see what there was, if there were any videos about Mary Daly. And there's a really great one by Holly Lawford Smith in the I think it's the gender critical series that she's done, Gender Heretics, I think, probably. And that's really worth watching. And as Marian said, there's some speeches and sort of things from Mary Daly herself which are really also fantastic. So that's really worth watching. And the other thing, I'll just pass over to you for a second. Sorry, Marian, I have to go and do something.
Yourself.
Yeah.
I didn't hear you. You muted yourself.
Yeah, sorry, Marian. Can I pass to you for a second because I need to do something?
Sure. What else do I want to say about Mary Daly? The other thing is that she talked about when she talks about the power of naming and the refusal to name things as they really are. One of the things that she talked about was lesbians, for example, refusing to name ourselves or to label ourselves as lesbians, which if we don't, leads to things like matrimony, leads to mental hospitals, leads to no good things. So to name things as they really are is painful, but that's what the purpose of the journey is. And that's why at the end of the journey is female friendship, even with just a few women. Because even being able to, to meet privately with just a few women who speak the same language with the same words, who can see what is really there in the foreground that men have created, even those few women, is incredibly powerful. And women who, meet in secret. I was at an event in New York City last weekend, protesting the men in women's sports in the Olympics, and there were a dozen of us, which is more than some events get these days, but is still just 12 women, and it was exhilarating in a way that it would not have been if it had been some patriarchal kind of event, or if it hadn't been just like-minded women. So finding those few women, even if it's in secret, even if it's a few, and even if that's what you have to do for a while, is very, very valuable. And she knows that. I mean, she talks about the power of female friendship.
The other thing I've noticed is if you look for Mary Daly on YouTube, there are very, very few, there aren't that many entries, and there isn't that much about her. And I think it's being covered. Well, her work is not that out there. There's a sort of economist in Ireland who's called Mary Daly, who comes up a lot, and there are a couple of other people who come up who are also called Mary Daly, who come up before her. Now, one thing that we've got at the moment is we've almost all of us have got the ability to record videos and to upload them onto YouTube. And Women's Human Rights Campaign, we've got a YouTube channel, and we save all our recordings so that if they did ever go down, we'd be able to keep them. But an idea is, if anybody felt like reading parts of Mary Daly, or indeed any other radical feminist works that you've got, and recording them, and then put them on YouTube, send the link, and we can start to make some playlists, so we can keep recordings of some of these works. And it's just these days it's more accessible to women, and possibly especially to young women, that if we were to read, say, one chapter of Mary Daly, they could listen to it and then think, yeah, I'm going to read this. So if anybody does do that, reads a chapter or a part of it, let's share it and put a load of this amazing work out there to make it more accessible. So that's what I would. The other thing I wanted to say is that there's a part in here, and I can't see exactly where it is, that talks very much, it talks about Janice Raymond and her book, The Transsexual Empire. And Mary Daly deals with men pretending to be women in quite a bit of detail. and it says that that's going to end up, she wrote this, was it 1984 or something, saying that their ultimate aim is the complete erasure of women. So oh, here we are, it's about page 66 or 67. She's sort of saying that it's Dionysian, like a Dionysian boundary violation that is happening in terms of it's part of the way that men try to erase women and sort of destroy us. So I'll just read this, which is interesting. It's page 67 of the American version. The madness which is the Dionysian final solution for women is confusion, inability to distinguish the female self and her process from the male-made masquerade. Dionysius is sometimes assumed a girl-like form. The phenomenon of the drag queen dramatically demonstrates such boundary violation. Like whites playing blackface, he incorporates the oppressed role without being incorporated in it. In the phenomenon of transsexualism, the incorporation confusion is deeper. As ethicist Janice Raymond has pointed out, the majority of transsexuals, this is in those days, are male to female, while transsex females basically function as tokens and are used by the rulers of the transsexual empire to hide the real nature of the game. In transsexualism, males put on female bodies, which are in fact pseudo-female. And then she goes on. So this is in the first section of gynecology. Now, this was written ages ago and understood, and it sort of annoys me when feminists or so-called women say, well, this came out of nowhere. We had no idea where this transgender stuff was coming. We did, because we read this. Like Mary Daly wrote about it, Janice Raymond wrote about it, and a lot of us read it. So
Patriarchal Empire, 1979.
Yeah.
I mean, it was there. It was there. It was all there. I remember in lesbian bars in the early 1970s, mid 1970s, where men who now we would call autogynephilic, heterosexual men, transgender, would try and come into the bars, or they would try and come into social, or sometimes they'd come in like after work in a business suit, wander in and say, oh, I didn't know, can I just have a drink? And be like, no, and at that time you could boot them out. Or they'd come to like social events that they couldn't be booted out from because it wasn't a lesbian bar, and they would completely ignore the gay male drag queens who knew what these guys were about. And they would try and glom onto lesbians, to young, cute lesbians. So they were around then. And I remember a few really smart drag queens and, lesbian bartenders saying, these guys, if shame is no longer keeping them in the closet, these guys are going to be a problem. These guys are absolutely going to destroy lesbian community. And they were right. I mean, these were, sharp people who saw this in the early mid 1970s. They were absolutely right. And that's why those spaces were so important. For lesbians, it was lesbian spaces. For women, it's women's spaces. There's a kerfuffle going on now in a music festival in the Midwest about, who should or shouldn't be allowed there. So us finding each other and speaking the same language is really critical. And she knows. I mean, she writes at the end of the book in terms of sparking, the fire of female friendship, that since brotherhood and fraternity are roughly equivalent to male comradeship, males also perceive a sharp contrast between the bonding designated by these terms and their bonding and friendship. But women, breaking away from the feminine condition, often tended first to imitate male comradeship, which is, I think, why we have problems sometimes, initially misperceiving sisterhood as something like the female equivalent of brotherhood. However, crones who have persisted in the otherworld journey have come to know deeply that sisterhood, like female friendship, has at its core the affirmation of freedom. Thus, sisterhood differs radically from male comradeship, brotherhood, which functions to perpetuate the state of war. It is a fundamentally different thing when we abandon patriarchy, abandon men, and don't set up a matriarchy instead, but simply abandon it. What can happen is completely different, but it means not using patriarchy as a model. It's a terrible model. Why would you want to, I mean, people say, it's like, don't you want to be equal with men? No, I don't want to be equal. Why? It's a demotion. No, really, I don't want to. I mean, men are lesser human beings, and it's not genetic. They're not born that way. But male socialization, by its nature, creates lesser human beings. That's what it does. A society, a world of complete female socialization, whatever may be wrong with that, would be better, far more livable than a world composed of strictly male socialization.
Yeah. Well, look, Marian, we've come to the end of our hour, and lovely as it is, we should stop, because then we'll have energy for the other meta-patriarchal activities in our lives on this is Sunday. So there's loads of women here. We've got 66 of us here today, which is fantastic, and we've been doing this, I think, 4 weeks. And it's going really well. So if you've enjoyed it, thank you so much for coming, and tell other, well, I suppose tell other women, but it doesn't really matter. We're doing fine as we are. So, but do tell other women if you want to, that this is good. Now, next week, the 8th of August, the 8th of the 8th, we have Sheila Jeffries,
My birthday,
and Joe Bart, and they're going to talk about the book Man's Dominion, which is a book by Sheila Jeffries.
Right.
So that will be really fantastic. Now, we're not sure what we're going to do the week after, but we've got some ideas. But the week after that, on the 22nd of the 8th, we've got Julia Long, Jodie Woodward, Nick Nesbitt, and Rizzillo, talking about Marian Fry's separatism, her essay on separatism.
Great.
And well, what we'll do is, as we find out what we're going to be doing, we will let you know about those different things coming up. And if you have ideas, put them in. Sorry, we didn't deal with, there were some questions, but we just, I think it's too complicated for us to actually answer the questions. So sorry, unless Marian, I don't know if you've answered, you can see any of the questions. They look too difficult for me to answer.
And just read the book out loud to each other.
That's the answer. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much. And if you need to or want to get in touch, you can email info@womensdeclaration.com about anything. And just thanks so much for being part of the meta-patriarchal process. Thank you, Marian.
Great, thanks.
Okay, bye everyone.